Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be taking a look at Oversimplified Mini Wars series, the very first video, the Falklands. I have not seen this one before, although I've seen a lot of the oversimplified stuff. This happens to be one of the ones I haven't seen, so I'm looking forward to sharing it with you guys. I know very little about the Falkland Wars. I'm assuming he's talking about the Falkland War anyway. It happened during my lifetime, but it's not one of those that was really on my radar. All I can remember about it is that it involved the British under Margaret Thatcher, and that the Falkland Islands down by the southern tip of South America. That's about the extent of my knowledge on this one. As always, I will have a link to the original content in the description below. Please head over to Oversimplified and consider watching this video there, giving him a like or a subscribe, anything we can do to support our original content creators, because we want them to keep creating videos like this one here. So, let's go ahead and get into this. I'll see what I can add to it as I usually do. I'm not sure there'll be much in this case, but we'll try.
Hi, English Mariner John Strong. Hi, Anthony Carey, 5th Viscount of Falklands.
Okay.
I would very much like for you to go to Chile and locate the wreck of a Spanish treasure ship for me. Okay.
Okay, yeah, there's the Falklands.
Hey, I found some islands.
Cool.
The English were probably not the first to discover the Falklands, but they were the first to write it down.
They
found it to be cold, wet, and miserable, just like home. So they established a colony in 1765, unaware that the French had also discovered the islands and done the same a year earlier. And for a while, the two were unaware of each other's existence until presumably there was an awkward moment where they ran into each other. Then the Spanish showed up and told the French that a couple hundred years earlier, the Pope drew a line on a map and said all of this belongs to Portugal and all of this belongs to Spain, and that the island was in Spain's territory and they would like the French to hand over their settlement. Now, since...
Yeah, so the Pope did do that. It was the Spanish Pope. He drew a line and basically said everything on the western side of that line belonged to Spain, everything on the eastern side belonged to Portugal. We're talking about unsettled regions, and by unsettled I mean not settled by Europeans, because none of that was unsettled, or most of that, vast majority of that was not actually unsettled. You had Native Americans in the Americas, you obviously had Africans in Africa, but Spain and Portugal didn't really count that when they decided to divide spheres of influence up like this. So yeah, Spain felt that they had a right to these islands because the Pope said they did.
The two were good friends, and Spain was willing to pay in cash money. The French obliged. But since they were still a little bitter about the recent 7 Years' War thing, they made sure to warn the Spanish not to let those dirty English on the other side of the island take over. So 7 Years' War, French and Indian War here in the States, is basically a global conflict. It is considered by some to be the first actual world war. The primary antagonist that start this out is France versus Britain. They're fighting initially over the Ohio territory in the States, but it balloons across Europe. Other countries get involved and they start fighting their own fights. And yeah, France basically ends up losing that. They lose a lot of their colonial possessions. So yeah, from that point forward, they've lost a lot of their colonial possessions, and they are determined to not let the British gain more, to help kind of keep a balance of power. The French, multiple times, France will take steps to try to prevent the British from getting former French colonies or French possessions. A good example of that would be the Louisiana Purchase, which Napoleon sells to the United States, in part because he wants the money. He no longer has Haiti. He's lost control of that due to the Haitian Revolution. He doesn't need the Louisiana Territory anymore. He doesn't want it to fall into British hands, so he sells it to the U.S. instead, just to keep it out of British hands. And it sounds like the same thing going on here, where France is basically saying, yes, we'll let you have it, Spain, as long as you promise not to let the British have it. Spain went over to the English and explained, Pope, line on map, Spain's island. And the English said, yeah, right, this is our island. But the Spanish had more guns, so they kicked them off anyway. But then England threatened to go to war. So Spain went to their friends in France and said, hey, it looks like stuff is about to go down. You in on this? And the French Minister of War said, yeah, and we'll launch a full-scale invasion of England and party like it's 1066. But then King Louis XV said, 1, you're insane, and 2, you're fired. Sorry, Spain, we're not ready for a war right now. So Spain had to give the English their settlement back, saying it's still our island, and the English said, no, it's our island. Then some colonists in North America got a bit rowdy, so the English had to leave their settlement to go focus on that. But they left behind a plaque that said this is totally still our island. So the island was in Spanish
I don't think that's gonna work.
hands. But then a French guy, no, not that one, that one, turned on the Spanish, took over
Napoleon Dynamite, I assume?
most of the country, and captured King Ferdinand VII. And in response, the Spanish colonies in South America started vying for independence. So Spain had a little bit on its hands and also had to leave the islands. And for a couple decades, the islands were left uninhabited except for the penguins, some fishermen, and the gauchos, which are basically like cowboys but cooler and Spanisher.
Yes,
And from Hamburg, living in the now independent United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, heard about the feral cattle roaming the Falklands and thought it would be a good way to make some money. So he got permission from both Buenos Aires and the British government to set up trade there as a private venture. Some American ships came down and began hunting whales and seals around the islands, and Verney wasn't too happy about it. So he asked Buenos Aires for some military assistance in defending the islands, but Buenos Aires said, meh, do it yourself, gave him some weapons, and appointed him governor of the islands. So he seized the US ships and arrested their crews. In response, 2 things happened. First, America came down and said, nice settlement you have there. Would be a shame if someone destroyed it. And then they destroyed it. Second, Britain heard
America.
Verney had been appointed governor, meaning the United Provinces, actually now the Argentine Confederation, were officially claiming the islands as theirs. So Britain showed up and said, hey, didn't you see our plaque? And since they had more guns, they kicked them off the island. And the Falklands remained firmly in British hands for the next century. They officially became a crown colony in 1840. Port Stanley became the island's capital in 1845. The cattle hides from the island weren't worth much, so they imported sheep from Britain in 1851. 2 world wars came and went, and all this time the Argentinians never rescinded their claim over the islands. Now it's 1976, and after a couple civil wars, a new brutal military dictatorship sponsored by the US fight against communism has taken control in Argentina, and by 1981, this guy was in power. The economy had been struggling for a long time, and Galtieri had been unable to improve the situation. Now if you ever find yourself the brutal military leader of a struggling South American country,
taking note, kids,
and you start getting into hot water, here's a bit of advice that has been tried and tested throughout the centuries. Start a war to distract everyone from their misery. Galtieri knew how popular he would be if he could finally take back Argentina's last Malvinas from the occupying British. There had been proposals to cut British military spending, and the ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance had been withdrawn from the area. So the Argentinians assumed the British may not even bother doing anything about the invasion. After easily capturing the largely uninhabited South Georgia Island, 600 Argentine troops were sent to the Falklands. The small number of Royal Marines and other British forces stationed there put up a small amount of resistance, but in the end had to surrender to the larger Argentine force. Crowds in Argentina celebrated the news, but they were wrong to assume the British would do nothing, because the person in charge of the United Kingdom at
Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, you don't mess with her.
the time was this lady. Thatcher was a somewhat controversial prime minister, but whether you loved her or hated her, there was no denying that she was tough. Like metal. Iron, for example. She immediately declared an exclusion zone around the islands and organized for a task force of over 100 ships to set sail for the Falklands. The United Nations expressed concern at the Argentine invasion. All South American nations apart from Chile backed Argentina. And since the United States had propped up the Argentine dictatorship, Reagan went to Thatcher and said, could you maybe just let them have the islands? And Thatcher said no. Okay, here, have some weapons. Fighting a war over 8,000 miles from home was a logistical challenge for the British. They requisitioned civilian cruise ships and containers, and they used British-owned Ascension Island as a forward base. By the time they arrived at the Falklands in May, the Argentine forces had had time to entrench themselves. The first task for the British was to gain control of the seas, which they did easily. On the 2nd of May, a British submarine sank an Argentine cruiser. The sinking was controversial, as it occurred outside the British exclusion zone. It was also the largest loss of life in a single incident during the war. And in response, the Argentine Navy withdrew from the islands. The next task for the British was to gain air superiority. While the Argentine Air Force controlled the skies, they were able to inflict considerable damage on the Royal Navy below.
Yeah, don't underestimate air superiority. Whoever has it has a huge advantage, especially on an island.
Days after the sinking of the General Belgrano, 2 Argentine super-étendards carried out a raid on the HMS Sheffield and sank it with an Exocet missile. For weeks, the Argentine Air Force would continue to carry out raids and inflict heavy casualties on the Royal Navy, with British Sea Harriers doing their best to take out as many of the Argentine aircraft as they could. While the battle in the skies raged on, San Carlos was chosen as the best landing site for the British ground forces. An SAS raid took out Argentine defenses on Pebble Island, and the HMS Alacrity sailed through Falklands Sound to flush out any Argentine supply ships. The landings began on May 21st, with Argentine aircraft carrying out full-scale raids on the task force ships taking part in the landing, damaging several and sinking a few, but anti-aircraft cannons and Sea Harriers shot down many of the aircraft in what became a major turning point for air superiority, and a beachhead was successfully formed. Then the ground troops began their movements out of San Carlos Carlos, across the north towards Stanley, and south toward the Argentine stronghold at Goose Green. In the following battles, a clear trend emerged. The Argentine conscripts put up a good fight, and with the rough, muddy terrain, the war was by no means easy for the British, but with highly skilled Royal Marine commanders and parachute regiment troops, the British would often find themselves taking on larger numbers of Argentinian soldiers, but would still come out victorious with minimal casualties. The 14-hour-long battle for Goose Green commenced on the night of May 28th. The battle ended in a decisive British victory, with over 900 Argentinians surrendering. Then, with 5,000 reinforcements arriving from the 5th Infantry Brigade, the British started preparing for their final assault on Stanley. In a series of hard-fought battles, they took control of the hills and mountains surrounding the town, as the Argentine forces withdrew with British ships shelling their positions from offshore. Utterly surrounded, on the 14th of June, the Argentinians surrendered, and the war was over. The 2-month-long war claimed hundreds of lives, and left the island strewn with minefields that still pose a problem to this day.
That's not unusual. I've mentioned this in some other videos, but minefields are a long-term problem all over the world. Anytime you're laying out minefields during war, you're going to have issues long-term with trying to find where they were all buried and removing them after the war. They still find them in France and Germany from World War II and World War I, for that matter. You find them throughout the Philippines, throughout Cambodia from the Cambodian genocide period, through Vietnam. It's a huge long-term problem.
Argentina still claims the islands, but in 2013 a referendum was held, and the islanders voted 99.8% in favor of remaining British. Plus, oil was just found near the islands, so the British probably aren't going to give them up anytime soon.
Nope. All right. Yeah, please support Oversimplified. We want to have this guy keep doing what he does. Anyway, that's the end of that. I wasn't able to add as much as I normally would because, like I said, even though I lived through this, I would have been Reagan era. I was mostly middle school, early high school, and I had other things to worry about than something like the Falklands Wars. I knew they were going on, but never knew much about them. So I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Anyway, until next time, I'll see you all later. Until then, bye-bye.